Culture is defined as the values, customs, beliefs, practices, language, and traditions shared by a group of people. The values, customs, beliefs, practices, language, and traditions shared by a group of people. We operate and exist in a variety of cultures. So think about all of the various cultures that you exist in, where you've learned the values, the customs, the beliefs, etc., etc. Here are some categories for cultures. Age, family. We call family the primary culture because this is where you learn, the first place that you learn your values, beliefs, customs, etc. We also have work cultures. Think about where you've worked or where you work and the culture that exists there. There are, of course, religious cultures. School cultures. Every school has its own way of doing what they do. Of course, we talk about ethnicity and race. We also can talk about gender as culture, along with sexual orientation. Now, there is a term that I want you to hold on to. It's called enculturation. enculturation. Enculturation is the process by which we learn about different cultures. So again, in your family, what you learned was through enculturation. What you learn when you start a new job, the culture there, that's called enculturation. So that's what enculturation is, the process by which we learn about different cultures. The next thing that I want to talk about are cultural values and norms. There are several that I will touch on. The first that I will talk about is low context versus high context cultures. Low context cultures are those cultures that want things specifically laid out. They do not pay a lot of attention to the nonverbal. They pay more attention to the actual words, the literal meanings of things. That's a low context culture, not paying a whole lot of attention to the nonverbals, but specifically to the words. Versus a high context culture is one where that's what they pay attention to most of, the nonverbals. They listen to the words, but they pay more attention to how the words are being expressed. The facial expressions, the tone, the gestures, the posture. All of that is where people from high context cultures, that's where they get the meaning from the nonverbals. The U.S. is considered a low context culture, while Korea would be an example of a high context culture. I will also point you to page 44 and the table 2.1 that gives you some examples of low context cultures versus high context cultures. The second point that we make here is individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures, it's more important for the individual to have success. That's what's important. In collectivistic cultures, it's more important that the group have success, that everyone has an opportunity for success. The U.S. is considered an individualistic culture, while a country like Japan is considered a collectivistic culture. Again, I point you to page 45, table 2.2 for some examples of individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures. The next point under cultural values and norms is low power distance versus high power distance cultures. This is on page 46. With low power distant cultures, it is more democratic and equal. The power is more or less shared. It's not concentrated. Whereas in high power distance cultures, the power is more concentrated. There are only a few controlling things. The U.S. would be considered a low power distance culture, while Saudi Arabia would be considered a high powered distance culture. The next point is low uncertainty avoidance versus high uncertainty avoidance. Low uncertainty avoidance can accept ambiguity. Everything does not have to be laid out. They don't avoid uncertainty. It's okay for everything not to be clearly stated and laid out the way things are going to be. They can accept that ambiguity. Whereas a high uncertainty avoidance culture, they want things predictable. They want things laid out. They want to know what's going to happen every step of the way. And so you have some cultures that they cannot, they want to know everything. They will ask questions. They will want to make sure that things are going to happen by a certain time in a certain way. And so again, the reason we talk about this is that you will have people from various cultures. Some people will accept the fact that we don't know exactly when things are going to happen, whereas some people will go, no, we have to know exactly how things are going to happen. The next cultural value and norm that we talk about is achievement versus nurturing. Achievement versus nurturing. In achievement cultures, there's a high value on material success and a focus on what's in front of me, the task at hand. So I want to get things done, and I want to be successful at doing it. Whereas nurturing societies, they provide more support in relationships. It's not so important that we get it done now, but that we work together to get it done, that we nurture each other in trying to reach this success. The next type of cultural value and norm that we talk about is what we call monochronic versus polychronic. Monochronic cultures see time as a commodity. It is more structured. Time is not to be wasted. It's a commodity. Whereas polychronic cultures do not live by the clock. Time does not have to be structured. It's not important to have things done by a certain time or meet at a certain time, but that things get done when they get done. There's no pressure. They're not pressured by the clock. Okay? And so again, you will run into people that come from both cultures. You'll have some people who are very strict and specific about it has to be done now, and others will come along and go, no, it doesn't have to be done now. Think about sometimes some cultures, starting a meeting at 3 o'clock means being ready to go at 2:55. In other cultures, starting a meeting at 3 o'clock means we might get started about 3:45. So again, that's what we mean by monochronic versus polychronic. And then a final cultural value and norm that I'll talk about is something we call short-term orientation versus long-term orientation. Short-term orientation cultures want it now. They want immediate gratification. Don't necessarily want to work long-term for anything. Want to try to get it as soon as possible. Versus long-term orientation, people who have a long-term orientation, they're willing to put in the work, willing to put in the effort. They don't have to see immediate results. If it takes 6 months to get to where they need to get to, that's fine. It's not a problem. And so again, you run into people that come from both cultures. Again, the U.S. might be considered a short-term orientation culture, while again, Japan, it may be considered more of a long-term orientation culture. The next area I want to talk about is developing intercultural communication competence. Developing intercultural communication competence. There are several things that we ought to look at. The first thing that we ought to look at is motivation and attitude. Motivation and attitude. This discussion starts on page 59 in your text. Motivation and attitude. What we mean by that is there should be a desire. There should be a desire to communicate with those from other cultures. The only way that we can become competent in communicating with people who come from other cultures than ours is by actually wanting to communicate, wanting to learn. And so that becomes a very important part of intercultural communication competence, just simply your motivation and attitude, having the desire to want to learn, to want to engage, to want to know. A second point under developing intercultural communication competence is there has to be a tolerance for ambiguity, a tolerance for ambiguity. You have to understand and be tolerant of the fact that people from different cultures see things differently. And so there may be some ambiguity there, some misunderstanding, some not seeing things the same way. And so if you can accept that, understand that that's going to exist, then that will make you a more competent communicator, because you have this knowledge that, okay, I may have to do something a little different. The understandings that I have may be different than the understandings they have. The values, all of those things may be different. And so I have to accept that there may be some ambiguity. The one thing I want to say here too is that a lot of times when we think about different cultures, we think about ethnicity or race, people who come from different cultures. But it isn't necessarily that. Again, even in a workplace, there are different cultures. The way that the sales team sees things is different than the way engineering might see things, is different than the way HR might see things. All of those are different cultures. And so we have to accept the idea that there's going to be ambiguity. They're going to see things differently. Even in those departments, they're going to see things differently. So we have to be willing to engage, talk to each other, communicate with each other to try to settle and solve some of the issues that we might have based on the fact that, again, we just do things differently. Departments do things differently. Different cultures do things differently. The third point under developing intercultural communication competence is that there has to be an open-mindedness. Again, an open-mindedness. Understand that maybe the way that you're seeing things may not necessarily be the way that somebody else sees them. On page 60, I want you to pay attention to a term. It's called ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism. And this is something that when we're dealing with people from other cultures, that we have to try to avoid. Ethnocentrism is an attitude that one's own culture is superior to others. An attitude that one's own culture is superior to others. And so what that does sometimes, it leads us down a bad path. That because we think that the way that we do things, our customs, our values, etc., are superior to other people, sometimes we discount other people and the way that they do things. We can't do that. We can't do that. We have to understand that people will do things differently. We have to be willing to express how we see it, but that doesn't mean that we say that somebody else is inferior or the way that they're doing it is inferior. It's just different. And so again, when we avoid ethnocentrism, then we've got a good chance of being open-minded and being able to learn and again work through things that we need to work through. A fourth point is what we call knowledge and skill. It's important to know what your knowledge level and your skill level is. If you understand you, then you have a lot better opportunity to understand others. Your ability to engage and deal with other people is better when you know your own behaviors and skills. On page 62, there's a discussion there, and one of the terms there that they talk about is mindfulness, awareness of one's own behavior and that of others. Communicators who lack this quality blunder through intercultural encounters mindlessly, oblivious to how their own behavior may confuse or offend others, and how behavior that they consider weird may be simply different. So again, we have to understand our own knowledge and skill and be mindful in engaging with others from other cultures. A fifth point is what we call patience and perseverance. Again, you have to be patient, but then you have to also persevere. You have to keep working at it. If a situation is such that there is some problems with cultural communication, it may take 2 or 3 or 4 times before you can get to a point of understanding. It may take longer than that sometimes. Again, you have to be patient. You have to be willing to work through.